We're ready? All right, cool. All right, trying to start on time. I have a lot of content that I'm going to try to get through. And at the end, if there's time for questions, try to shoot some questions. And if there isn't, I'll be hanging out by the Cardinal Solutions booth. That's just right around the corner. But my name's Kevin Mack. I'm a UI UX developer. I work at Cardinal Solutions, so I'm a consultant. And I work on, I'm inside our user experience group. And I work on both the designing as well as the front-end architecture for different applications and wide ranges of projects. In addition to being a consultant, I started the Columbus Web Group with my buddy Adam Weiss 3 years ago, and Sean Duran, who's over here in the front, he's actually speaking today at 3:30 in room 1. So it's kind of ironic that two of us are speaking, but we started the Columbus Web Group, and the idea of the Columbus Web Group was to educate the community of Columbus and provide free education. So we put on monthly meetups, and the idea of our monthly meetups are to inspire people. So come to one of our meetups, next day be able to apply it the next day. In addition, and those are usually on methodologies, best practices, and approaches, and then we also do what are called weekend workshops. They're limited to 10 people per class, and they're 1 to 4 week long courses that are based around the 10 people that sign up. So if you get in the class, and they sell it super fast, so as quick as 2 minutes and as long as 26 hours, but if you get in that class, we send out an email to you and we say, what's your background and what do you want to get out of this class, and we base that course around you. And we're always looking for suggestions, so the best way to find out about our upcoming events as well as the opportunities for education like our weekend workshops is go to columbuswebgroup.com and to follow us on Twitter. And I truly mean that we're looking for input from everyone. And if there's something that you want to learn, just reach out to us and we'll try to make it happen. So cool. Now, getting into actually the outline slide of what I'll be talking about and try to keep me on track. So there's going to be 8 different sections. Each section's 2 hours long, so we should be done by tomorrow morning around 4, I think. But we're going to talk about the definition of a style guide. We're going to get into the contents of what goes into a style guide, and then we'll talk about tacos because everyone loves tacos, and it hopefully will make sense. Then we're going to get into the layers of a style guide. So this is something I've been working on for the past year, and it's about the architecture and also how you craft out style guides. In addition, the classic conversation about who owns a style guide, how do I get this to happen in my organization? That's what we'll get into. And then the process and the ways that we've kind of refined and defined how we go about creating one of these types of projects. And most people, I feel like in talks, don't talk about pain points. So I want to call out some of the pain points and give you some takeaways and things to kind of avoid. And from my experience of doing these, a lot of things that have been incredibly annoying and incredible pain points, hopefully you can avoid. And then kind of wrap up with benefits. So it should be kind of fun, hopefully. I don't know if, is this exciting? All right, cool. All right, so getting into what a digital style guide is. And I recently did a variation of this presentation, and I got some feedback on this. So when I'm talking about a style guide, this is really just a listing out of the individual components that make up an interface. So you would take the style guide and the individual components, kind of copy and paste them, and build out different websites. So this is not talking about building out a website. This is creating its own separate project to identify core components that are going to be utilized and be reused inside of an interface. So we're not talking about building out a website right now. We're talking about the ingredients that make a website. And the big thing that I really like to hit on there is that it is its own separate project. So you'll hear me say that a few times in here. Also, kind of from the beginning, talking about what a style guide is, there's always this conversation about frameworks and different toolkits that are out there. When I'm talking today, I'm talking about custom application development and not using a Bootstrap or any of those tools that are out there. I'm actually very opposed to Bootstrap, and they make it way too easy that their initials are just BS, because I also call it like complete boot crap is another word that I use for it, but that's also because I feel like I'm a 12-year-old boy. But in this presentation, I'm not talking about Bootstrap, but I'm talking about creating custom interfaces and identifying those core pieces that are going to make up your different applications that are out there. So getting into what makes up an interface, a style guide, And again, it's not bootstrap, but it's to bootstrap your projects, meaning that you have a listing of all these core components that you can reuse and start on day one with a listing of different components. So bootstrapping your projects, making sure that they're going to be scalable. What's involved inside of a style guide are design patterns. So by design patterns, I mean core components and common designs that are built around the interface. Every interface usually uses the same designs, just in different variations. There's common things that are out there like the media object, the flag object, and the different column systems, especially in the responsive landscape. Style guides contain styles and markup, which is HTML and CSS, as well as JavaScript, and that's the core basis behind them. They include visual representation, so visual designers as well as anyone on the team can actually see what these components are. And then with that, they can see the actual code and actually copy and paste those core visual representations and utilize them in their project. The last piece, and really one of the most important ones here, is documentation. Everyone loves documentation if someone else does it. Everyone hates doing documentation. And for a style guide to be really successful as well as to be utilized and useful for your team, documentation is one of those core pieces when you're building out a style guide. In addition, they should include all sorts of variants and versions, meaning that you're not just designing one piece and it's going to fulfill all the needs. You may have multiple components that look the same, but there's different use cases. An example of this would be a button versus an anchor, but maybe your anchor looks like a button and your button looks like a button. So depending on the use cases of how you want to implement it inside your design and the interface, you want to be using the right HTML elements, and your style guide should be able to be adaptable to fulfill the needs of whatever the different contexts of HTML elements they are. In addition, the context of how people are interacting with these. So this is getting into really the responsive side of it. So how these pieces adapt from small screens to large screens, other various contexts out there, such as having touch capabilities, as well as how people are interacting with them. So to kind of break down an interface, and this should go without saying, but this is not a true interface. This is just a representation of an interface I put together. So this is the desktop view of a website. How many people here are familiar with responsive web design? Good, good, good. Okay, so not going to dive into that at all, but here's the desktop view. So here we see a two-column grid here, and there's a header, there's an introduction, two-column grid, but then of course on mobile, due to limitations of size, it goes to a single column. One of the things that, as you're building out a style guide, one of the pieces that you have is a structural component and the grid system inside there. So when you're thinking about those different contexts, especially in responsive, you may want to build a grid that goes from a two-column to a single column, or a two-column that remains as a two-column from big screens to small screens, or maybe even a small screen two-column to a desktop single column. So that's what I mean by those different variants and different contexts, especially for responsive. One of the big things, and I'm definitely a hardcore broken record when I talk about UI architecture as well as style guides, is to make them scalable and flexible, or scalable and maintainable, as well as flexible to fulfill the needs of the content. By scalable, I mean that you're building something based around the current landscape that you know today, but you're also kind of planning for the future and those unknowns of projects and content that you may not have in your current index. Maintainable, just making sure that it's easily updatable and manageable by your team. And we'll talk about some of the methodologies that go into play when building out interfaces, but making sure that it's crafted in a way that people can easily manage and maintain it. And flexible is really hitting hardcore on the content side, making sure that you're building out things to fulfill the needs of the content. I like to talk about the difference between content containers and containers for content. So content containers are when you build out a structure that is very limited and it has requirements on the content. So a title can only be a maximum of 120 characters. It needs a minimum of 60 characters, or the interface looks broken. A container for content is when you build something that's really flexible and can flow a lot easier, and the content can be whatever you want to put in there. There's not really a right or wrong, but there's more use cases when building out style guide and structures to fulfill the needs of containers for content. And of course, content for containers are used for things like hero messages and introductions to pages. Getting into the second piece here, which are the contents of the style guide. So kind of hitting off and taking a step back, looking at what really are the core pieces. When people talk about style guides, they really are about the front end, so the CSS and the JavaScript, and of course the HTML and the DOM. But right here, why I like to bring this up, I used to be really opposed to putting JavaScript inside of style guides and reusable components. But nowadays, as I'm building out style guides, I include JavaScript, but it's more of a global JavaScript file that's namespace, that's accessible, and being able to be utilized and implemented in any of my JavaScript MVC frameworks or whatever the JavaScript architecture may be. But the real big thing for these style guides is making sure that CSS, you're supporting JavaScript, but it's really a focus on front-end architecture. In addition, when building out style guides, the other core components, and this kind of goes without saying, but you're building an interface that's wrapped around the experience. So the interface needs to be derived by how people are interacting with it, and making sure that you're not just making an anti-pattern design and you're making something that is useful and usable for users. But the most important piece is, and this is a really sweet transition, is the content. I've always wanted to use that transition, and I figured like this presentation would be perfect for it. But content's at the core of all website designs, and it always has been since the beginning of website development. So I started developing in '95. In the early days of the web, that's all we did was we were trying to bubble up the content and provide materials for different clients as well as for myself. Like, why would people want to come to my website? Over the years, I feel like we've gotten away from the conversation about content. It's always been like, let's make something really cool, or let's do an advertisement that no one really cares about. But the most important piece is content, especially when we're building out a style guide. So you want to make sure that your interface is being able to fulfill the needs of the known and unknown pieces of the content, and the experience is focused around delivering the content to the user in a usable way. Now, getting through a list of the pieces of what makes up a style guide. So number one is branding. And by branding in a style guide, we're talking about digital branding. Digital branding is very different than traditional branding. The example that I like to give, especially with colors or either your logo. So your logo on a big, like on a big printout or the posters outside, it's really easy to have really detailed things. But once we're dealing with small screens, your logo may have to adapt and change. So inside style guides and also the branding, you need to be thinking about how maybe assets or media need to change, especially with something as important as your logo. But colors also are very different on the web and across different devices. So cyan is a color, it's an aqua color. It's actually part of the Cardinal brand. When we print it off, it looks like this dark blue color. The walls at our office kind of look more like a sea foam. It's one of those colors that does not translate very well. So we're actually going through and rebranding for the digital space right now, and we're having those types of conversations like, what is our true blue? Are we this digital blue, this bright blue on the computer, or are we more like our wall color or the printed version? So we're exploring what our brand is actually in the digital sense. It's something that a lot of people have done when working with marketing firms and the branding side, but I feel like people just give you some hex colors, which were just based off the PMS colors that was going to be printed. But there's a lot more exploration that needs to happen for the branding side, especially when you're building this out. Typography are those things like your page header, section header, article headers, and the paragraph inside there. This is one of those key pieces that's really, really important to building out a style guide and making sure that you're having consistent sizes as well as looks and identifying them as a team. Call to actions, or CTAs, I say that a lot if you're not familiar with the abbreviation of it, but these are things like buttons, anchors, even submits for form fields and input type of submit, making sure that they're consistent and able to navigate the user through the experience very easily. Also with everything here, and especially call to actions, is making sure that they're accessible, and by accessibility I mean the minimum size of at least the index of your finger, which on average is 30 pixels by 30 pixels. So making sure everything that's a call to action is clickable for people with fat fingers, and especially on mobile devices. Media treatments get into the imagery as well as video, background images, the responsive images that are out there, and making sure that you're setting requirements around imagery. So a lot of times you build out this really nice interface, but no one ever documented what are the dimensions of our size? What should we cut that background image to? How does this work on a responsive landscape? My buddy Tim Vonderlo and I created a methodology for creating images on the web. This was when I was working on the responsive images. So through that, we also wanted to outline a way to architect and craft imagery for the web. And it was called Asset Template Guides, which is a combination of print design and web design. And we use the same keywords as bleed, safety, as well as trim and crop. And it allows us to really focus on how images are going to work from small screens to large screens. Talking about Asset Template Guides is its own topic, but there's a really great video, because I said it and I'm talking about myself, but it's a really great video that I did on Asset Template Guides. And the form. So really no interface can exist or experience can exist without form fields. And this is one of those core things that needs to exist when you're designing an interface. Form fields are actually one of the most difficult things to design around, especially making it cross-browser. And if you're trying to brand it to your experience. They're also one of the most messed up things when interacting with them on a mobile device. List items are the least sexiest out of all of these, but they're definitely core to every single interface. And it's one of those other ones that has so many variations and the different implementations of where they're going to live inside of the context of your design. Structural is really based around the grid structure, that tabular data, and how it's going to work from small screens to large screens. So I talked about how you have a grid system that changes from small screen to large screen and goes both ways. So making sure that your interface is built to be adaptable and far-reaching to fulfill the needs of the different content types and displaying different pieces. Navigational at a global level is kind of limited in a style guide, but you should have the strategy of how navigation should work. So these are more of design patterns, but not the full implementation. So as we get into the layers of style guides, we'll talk about the different breakdowns from global to application, but navigation is definitely something that is in there from a more strategic view. Utilities are helpers, so everything that I'm talking about here is really about combining different classes as well as different components to make pieces of your interface. And utilities and helpers are they're single classes that have single use, and they're related to maybe some kind of style or positioning thing. Examples of this is maybe changing a color, as well as alignment being center aligned, left aligned, or right aligned. The most important out of all these is actually the front-end architecture. So again, a lot of people think style guides are just this long list of components. But in reality, the most important piece is what's happening behind the screen and behind the scenes here, not screen. But, and that's the front-end architecture. So making sure that this is crafted to be scalable, using methodologies like SMAX, BEM, ITCSS, and object-oriented CSS to build out these different components in the CSS to be maintainable, flexible, and scalable. And even though you're visually going there and you're seeing a list of components, it's not really, no one needs to know what the architecture looks like, except for the execution development team that's crafting it, as well as maybe maintaining and managing it. But when I'm talking about style guides, I feel like I actually get into a lot of conversations about architecture, which I lose half the marketing people or designers in the room. All right, getting into tacos. Who here likes tacos? That's it? Tacos are great, right? Yesterday was Cinco de Mayo. We had tacos yesterday. I did. All right, cool, thanks. All right, so here's a taco shell. And why I'm using this as an analogy, this is something that came up when I was trying to discuss what style guides were to non-technical people. And the taco became a really great example of it. So it actually stands for Talk About Component Organization. So it's an acronym. And a taco has lettuce. It can have tomato. It can have some protein inside there. And it can have some cheese. Now, if I want more tacos, what do? I just get more shells, more of the same components, and I make 3 of them. Now, if I introduce a new ingredient, so let's say I have a flour tortilla, and I then look at, so I've introduced a new ingredient here, and it's just a flour tortilla. But if I want to make a quesadilla, what do I put in it? I put lettuce, I put tomato, I put some protein, and I add some cheese. So now I've introduced only one new ingredient, but one new product, but I have the same ingredients used from tacos and a quesadilla. I just throw a top on this, and it bounces. And now I have a quesadilla. So I have two unique things that are made up of the same ingredients. Now, where this even gets, so that was an introducing of one new ingredient, but I can even utilize the same ingredients and make a burrito. Fire, fire, fire. And what is a burrito made up of? It could be made up of the exact same ingredients, so the lettuce, tomato, protein, and cheese. So here I have three different complete products, but they're made out of the same core ingredients, two of which are actually 100% identical. They're just in different form factors. So why this is an example of thinking about style guides is, as you're building out style guides, it's more about how you can reuse and repurpose, and think about the different contexts of how you want to serve up that content. And there's three things I like to say about this taco analogy. So it's the focus on reuse, so using the same pieces that kind of work, how you can combine them together, and then create when necessary. So how those pieces can come together, and I really say create when you really have to. Ideally, you're trying to reuse and manipulate the same content and designs that you have and try to just scale it out there. So it's the idea of don't change something if it works, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel every single time. And crafting out architecture for the front end should really be about this reuse, combining, and then when you need to create. So we are halfway through this, which is fun. So this is a concept that I've been working on for the past year, and I've been working on style guides over the past 6 years. So almost every single project that I've had has had some kind of form of a style guide. Even before starting using style guides, the way that I crafted and created the designs for websites, I looked at individual components and made sure that they worked really well. And the concept of style guides kind of came out, and it just kind of clicked for me. But where I always struggled was the difference between what I used to call two different types of style guides: a global style guide for a company or brand, and an application style guide for a brand. So a lot of times when I was building out maybe a website redesign, I would think, I need to make a style guide just for this website. And then I would also have conversations with clients and be like, would you guys need a global style guide, which is more of like your extension of your brand and that digital branding? But it wasn't until recently that I realized that I had been doing it wrong, and it's actually about these layers on it. So the first layer is this global layer, and the global layer is really the far-reaching piece of the style guide. These are your core components. This is just your DOM and your CSS, so HTML and CSS. And this is the identification of all those core components that you're going to have. So I put that list out there earlier. That's what starts off in the global. And it's supposed to be very thin and unstyled. But it will include some like resets and normalize. The next layer, and this layer can actually be coupled with the global one, but a lot of brands and companies have multiple brands inside them. So this is where you start adding more specific components that are related to your brand and who you are as a company, or the individual unique aspects of your business, and you're adding actual styles to it. So it's kind of like theming it. Now the next layer is where we kind of take a huge jump and we get into the application side. And these are unique components, and it's really extending everything that you had and creating new pieces. So where this kind of breaks away from where I used to think was, I used to design at a global level for all the content and the unknown content. which is something that you still do at the global level, but it was restricting my designs and the interface that I was building because I was trying to be too far reaching. At the application layer, what I can do is really focus on the content that exists for that project and make sure that my structures, my breakpoints, the components that I'm building out are actually aligning to fulfill those needs of the content. So it gets very specific to the needs of that individual project. The last layer here is the campaign or the one-off. And this is something that as you're building and going down these layers, this is like if you're a big organization or a small organization, you hire a marketing group. A lot of marketing groups still, even for a month-long campaign, may come to you and be like, we created you the style guide. And it's like, well, that's just for this one campaign. That's not the way that we talk as a company or develop our code or craft our HTML and CSS. Or they merge that CSS and HTML into your global styles, which then creates this trash collection over time. The idea here is to separate it out where they inherit everything from those top layers, and then they create new components whenever they need to. And these can be unique and identified to be kind of throwaway at a later time. So looking at these layers and how this works is we have the brand layer and it trickles down from top to bottom. So we have that global one, which is really the HTML and CSS that are resets and identification of core components that exist in every interface. The branding is the styling that's going to go all the way down to the very bottom. And the application, we have new components that are based around the content. Now, if I have two brands, so this is an example that I have a global and I have two brands inside there, I can also have different applications inside. So here is one company that has a global style guide and listing out of all the components, and then there's two different brands inside there. So say it's maybe a company that has a special section of their website for kids. Now, they still have some core components at a global level that are going to be shared from one site to another, but they may have some additional components that are more fun, more targeted, and designed differently to fulfill the needs of entertaining a kid, I guess. Inside there, what we can also do is break down into different campaigns after the application layer. And by application, I just want to say, like, don't really overthink it, but an application can be a .com, it could be the member portal. So those are two different applications. So anything that you would almost break off into its own repository in Git or SVN or TFS, whatever you're using, that would require a different style guide. But you're inheriting from the top to the bottom, reusing as many pieces and parts that you can, and then identifying those projects and extending that style guide to fulfill that need. Now, if something becomes very useful at an application layer, and you're seeing application on the right here and application on the left here, having the same core components, what you could do is bubble it up and move it into that global style guide and make sure that it becomes accessible for all projects that you have. So here you're managing really just one layer of core components, and then for every application you're inheriting those and extending and adding new core components. Now getting into example, which will hopefully bring this together. Who knows what a button is? Come on. All right, cool, thanks. So here's a button, and this is a global button. So all this has is some HTML here, and I'll show you the CSS in a second, and it's styled at a global level. So what the CSS here is, it's more of a reset and a normalize. So by that I mean I've written the code here to make sure that this button can be applied to a button element or an anchor element. So utilizing these classes here, I could change it on different elements. I'm still going to get the look and feel. I could even add it on a span and it would work the same way. But this is really a reset and it's not styled. So there's certain things inside of a button that I still need to identify and style at the next layer. So looking at this brand. Here we have this blue button that has black text, which this is a button that is a default button as well as a primary colored button. So that's what the DOM and the class is here on this guy. So we've introduced a color on the primary, but then I've styled at the details level a bold and uppercase. So whenever I have a default button, they're always going to be bold and uppercase. But now I have the flexibility to say, hey, I have a primary button, I have a secondary button. Let's change it from blue to maybe orange or whatever that secondary color may be. And we'll talk about colors here in a second. And then one of the interesting things about how buttons work across different browsers, they don't inherit the actual font family from the parent. So you actually have to define the font family at that level if it's a button or a submit, type submit input. So you have to identify that here. And I remove the border also. So here we have this guy, and it includes both the global as well as the brand, and it gives me that look. Now, if I introduce a secondary brand here, and this button looks very different to the second button and even the first one, but they're all utilizing the same HTML as well, HTML and CSS classes. So nothing has changed from one to another. It's just extending CSS. So CSS is a language of extending, not overriding. So by overriding, I mean avoiding those slashes that you see in your inspect tool. You should not have those. So this is a way to organize and craft your CSS as well as to create reusable components. So I can start building out structures and patterns at a global layer and then apply my CSS theming for my different brands and actually have two unique look and feel, but having the same DOM. Did I lose anyone on that? You guys are quiet. All right, cool. Can we circle back at that? But yeah, not inside this deck, but I could talk about one. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we could definitely talk about that. But I guess really quickly, so brand to app would be, again, if I'm styling, a really quick example would be I'm doing a redesign of the .com, so the marketing side. But then there's a member portal. So let's say you're a bank, and you're a bank that has their whole marketing side, and it's advertising, like, get this credit card. It only has 28% interest, and all that fun stuff, and who we are. And then, but why users are actually going there is probably to sign in and see their bank account. So when you go into that bank account, there's a bunch of new components that need to be designed, especially tabular data. So I want to see my transactions that came through, which date it happened, who it went to, the amount of money left in my bank. Now, that tabular data wouldn't exist at the brand layer or the global layer because it's specific to that application of the member portal. So I don't want to bubble that guy up and include it in my HTML, because what if I have another project over here that is, I'm trying to think of another one for a bank, but say they're, I don't know, trying to think of something, maybe their internal portal. So maybe they have a user portal for all their current employees to utilize. Now, the employees don't need to see how those transactions work, so I would have another application that's maybe like their portal and have those components kind of separated out. But if I identify that those, like the bank accounts, the transactions need to be in both those applications, I can bubble up and put it in the brand and global. So the idea is really to focus at a far-reaching at the global and then build out specific needs at the application. And then as it grows over time, identifying pieces and components that are reusable and can be then accessible. So it's to avoid rewriting HTML and CSS and try to utilize it across different projects. Is that helpful? All right. All right, the ownership. This is everyone's favorite conversation as an advisor, as a consultant, and I've been in this conversation more times than I would love to admit. And sometimes it gets really heated because there's always this one guy in the company that is absolutely right, but that one guy in that company has zero say. He just is a really good hard worker. And then his manager or her manager is like, hey, Jonathan over here has this idea for a style guide, and he wants to make it go across my whole global organization. And everyone's like, that's not going to happen. That's just Jonathan. And what happens is there's maybe a Sarah over here that's also developed the same concept and the idea. And Sarah's manager is like, hey, Sarah's going to redesign everything in our company. Look at what she did. And they show it to everyone else. They're like, well, Jonathan's doing that, and we're not using that. So there's a lot of this like ownership and different style guides and different projects that are happening in different silos in companies. But it adds to conflict as well as a lot of stress in companies. But what isn't happening is a conversation across the whole organization. So the ownership of a style guide, if done properly and successfully, is across multiple different departments and organizations within your company. So IT, your developers, your front-end devs, anyone that's really on the execution team, both back-end and front-end. Because another piece when building out style guides is we should be designing and developing and crafting our code to fulfill the needs of the platforms that we have to support, so those limitations and capabilities. In addition, of course, our marketing friends and the people that are brand advocates, making sure that you're designing and developing and its alignment to whatever that brand is. And again, I talked about the digital branding. The digital branding is an extension of the brand. So you're going to have to create new components that didn't exist. Very important is nowadays everyone has a user experience or a UX team. And having those team members involved in the project and making sure that they're talking through all the different use cases as well as the interactions that may happen with core components. And you wouldn't believe how long you can talk about an interaction of clicking on a button, but I've definitely been in conversations for over 2 hours about interactions of clicking on a button. But if done right, and at a global level and everyone's involved, you can make sure that that interaction is being utilized and being able to be reproduced across the whole landscape of all your different projects. QA, testing, making sure that you're putting out quality code. Again, style guides are this collection of different people, but also writing, including your BAs and making sure requirements are being fulfilled. They may know something that you don't know as a developer, as a designer, bringing everyone to the table and making sure that you're writing quality code that is reusable. And then the business side. So the business has a lot of say in decision making, and those are the people that you go to and you say, hey, we need X amount of dollars to build this out. But bring them along from the beginning. It is an educational process and helps them identify why this is important. So everyone owns it. The company owns it, which we'll talk about pain points. So the creation, which is the crafting and creation of the style guides. So how we approach this at Cardinal and how I've been doing this over the years, it's evolved. It starts with a brand strategy and identifying the brand and the way that our brand needs to be the essence of us and how we want to be portrayed across that digital landscape. So the brand strategy needs to be in there. User research, identifying how people are going to be interacting with the applications that you currently have and kind of forecasting those future applications that you may have. And you can always go back and add to style guides. So again, they're always evolving and changing. And user research should definitely be in there and helping evolve those pieces. User research also is kind of twofold because not only is the style guide supposed to be used to copy, paste, and reuse on future projects and applications, but there's this other side of user experience of the core execution team utilizing the actual output of the listing of the style guide. So there's the style guide itself as a tool on its own project and the interactions that the development team or the execution team's using, but then there's also how do the core components actually work in their final living spot. So investigating how people are going to be using and utilizing it within your organization. Indexing components. So indexing components is when you look at everything that you have in your whole landscape. So looking at all the different applications, identifying core components outside of that list that I had. Every organization, every business, every industry has some core components that need to be built out, and you might as well put that in that global layer and make it accessible across all your projects. So indexing is a really tedious but fun thing to do. I once indexed 126 buttons on a single application. Unique buttons. That was fun. We cut it down to 3, though. So the next one is style tiles. And style tiles have kind of gone out over time, but I still like to use them. And I've kind of changed what they are and the meaning of them. So style tiles to me are, if I'm redesigning my kitchen or my bathroom, maybe I hire a designer. And they come to me with some paint samples, some wood samples, some flooring samples, whatever. And they lay it out, and they have like different options for me. That's pretty much what a style tile is, but in the digital sense. They put some colors, they put some fonts, they put some treatments, and it's just to make sure that we're aligning with the brand. They're incredibly helpful to have early conversations about the transition of your brand from the traditional sense to the digital sense, or if you're doing it for the very first time and you're a new company and you're trying to identify who you are. So it's getting that essence of your company. The next one, and this was a game changer for me, were element collages, and this was created by Dan Mull. And what they are, and I have an example of it on the next slide, they're individual pieces of the interface just kind of laid out, not as pages, but as the core components. So those are those main things that I talked about, the global layer, but also other pieces that you've identified by indexing, making sure you're designing out those. And they become not just a blueprint, but the guidelines of developing and designing the interface. One of the best things that have come out of it is, especially looking at call to actions and the different states that a button may have. One of the things that drives me off the wall is inconsistency from one thing to another thing. And by identifying something as how the color treatment's going to be on an anchor and those hover states, and maybe there's variant, like there's a red anchor, there's a blue anchor, but then what happens when I go over it? Does it turn green? Does it turn black? Does it do the reverse of the other color? But identifying and lay those out on a page becomes that blueprint, and the development team, and as you're crafting it out, can start making those decisions about how the CSS code will be. So it just becomes this really nice blueprint and strategy for architecting out your code. Something that we created was called a stress test, and all stress tests are, we look at individual components. So after the element collage, we, of course, go into the HTML and CSS. I don't put that on here, but imagine that there was a line there. So that's like the step 1 to 500. But so stress tests are, you take your individual components once they've been created, and you go through your requirements. So every component has a minimum character count, a maximum character count, and you try to break them based off the content. And the reason why you try to break them is to create variants or versions of them that may look the same, but can fulfill the different needs and context of the content. And this is looking at from the smallest screens to largest screens, from different variants that browsers may have, as well as contextual factors and interaction states. So this is something that has also changed the way that I've crafted and designed, because you can even change your grid system based off those content needs. And this is probably going to be something, as the element query or the content query comes out, that people talk more and more about, and how you craft the interface to be adaptable. And context, and this is really just after you go through all those, before we get to testing, you just want to test it actually on the devices, as well as looking at in different variants and turning things on and off. Also looking at how pointers may work versus a swipe versus touch down, touch up, or touch down, touch start, and touch down. God, I said it again. I have football on my mind. I blame that guy. But yeah, so it's just looking at the different contexts. In CSS right now, it's going to be coming out that not only will we have the ability to look at different hover states, there's actually going to be interaction states that are coming out, which include those different contextual factors. And that should be coming out this year, which is going to be really awesome. And lastly, tests. So style guides, they should be tested at this point. And if you test it as the individual components, when you start combining them later on, you've already cut out a huge amount of time of testing and potential error. I should have recorded that. So here's an example of an element collage, again, with a fake interface. But this is really the start of the design process for us after we've gone through the research and indexing of the components. So off to the left, you see these colors. You see what are supposed to be representation of different typography and header treatments and some of the core components. So this can be as big as your organization and your application needs, or it can be really small. I've made some of these that have very few components or actually structural pieces on it, and I made some that were outrageously large. But the idea here is you're listing them out in really no order. It's just to start getting that feel of what core components can be before you get into development. So this year I've been working on an open source project every month, just because I don't like having free time. And one of the ones that I came up with is this concept on color. And this was, I mentioned Tim earlier, but Tim Von der Lohe and I geek out and about crafting, especially large scalable projects. One of the things that we came up with was this naming convention for colors. So both he and I have been designing and developing for the web for way too long. And what we've identified is majority of brands have two colors. They have a primary color, they have a secondary color, and at times they have a tertiary color. But we also noticed that when building out the websites, a lot of the issues that we've had have also been we only have those 2 or 3 colors, but why in our palette do we have 29,000 colors and variants? So what we identified was that every single interface has a dark color, it has a primary color, it has a secondary color, it has a light color, and it has what's referred to as an accent color. But then where this kind of goes a little bit deeper is for each one, you have a dark version of it, a light version of it, and an accent version of it. So we have primary dark, we have primary light, we have primary accent. We have accent dark, we have accent light, we have accent. And what this gives you is you've identified 5 colors from the beginning, and then you multiply them by 4, you have 20 colors in your palette, but it seems like a lot, but they're just variants of the same color. And what this also allows us to do is stop talking about semantic coloring and start talking about the actual use case and the name for it. So if I'm like, hey, this needs to be the primary color, I don't need to be like, it needs to be hex value, whatever. Or I can be like, let's make this the primary dark, or let's try and see what the primary light looks like in this context. And also it has the variance of making sure that your content is accessible with contrast ratios. So not just the color itself, but how 2 colors interact with each other by utilizing your other palette pieces. So that's why secondary dark has that light color. The secondary light and secondary dark have white and black. Here it's actually a dark gray, but it's to pass contrast ratios. So I have this on my CodePen. It's codepen.io, Kevin Mack. But this has been something very helpful, especially in the documentation and conversations. So one of the pieces I also kind of skipped over earlier was style guides become this really great tool for improving communication within your team. And that's one of those things that has really helped. So we can stop talking about hex values or RGBA colors and start talking about what they actually are implemented. The next one, and that's where we usually start with building these out, is the colors and those breakdowns. I'm releasing an article hopefully next week, but it's called Object-Oriented Typography. And what it is my obsession with typography, especially in branding as well as the web. And it's the breakdown that every interface has a header, has an H1 through H6. So by default, the browser has defined those for us. So there should be only really 6 main sizes in your interface, your largest size to your smallest size. And having those consistent things identified from the beginning is part of what we put in our element collage and the architecture of our style guides. And then for object-oriented typography, we have the sizes. We have the separation of context versus the content and the styling for it. So by that, I mean there's different HTML elements that you're supposed to use in the cases of implementing content. So there is a use case for using an H1 versus an H4. And sometimes your design, you try to break what those meanings are in those use cases to fulfill the visual representation of it. And that's absolutely wrong. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to resolve with that. And with that, it also comes with that every interface usually has a page header, a page subheader, a section subheader, an article header, an article subheader, and then a paragraph tag. And there may be some variants of each of those, but starting at those 2 points gets you so far along in your interface, and the consistency of just identifying colors as well as your typography and the treatment for it, it becomes very far-reaching across their site. And then, of course, your button and interactions in those states that I talked about, form fields. Woo. So after we have the element collage, we again craft the code, and there's different tools that we use. I'm trying to move more into a custom solution. I help work on Fabricator, which is an open source style guide toolkit. And I also created a new version of Pattern Lab as a framework for development. And again, those are not style guides themselves. Those are just helpers to help you develop and identify and have your team identify the components, copy and paste them. But the best way of doing it is actually creating your own around that user research in your company and how your team is going to be utilizing them. So after we have those pieces identified, you can combine them and create pages. And then you can utilize and change them around in different contexts to make different pages. So once you have these core components, if the style guide has them all listed out, you can just make variants of this. So these are just bringing out different core components and rearranging them. Back to that taco example, it had the same ingredients. There's just different contexts and different order that they may be putting them together. All right, so it can't solve it all. Woo! I don't know why I make a ghost noise for every transition, but it can't solve it all, and there's many pain points. The biggest one is politics. So at companies, the politics isn't necessarily just the ownership of it. That is a huge one, and that is something that needs to be resolved as a company. But more importantly is, when do we build a style guide in the company? And it should happen before the application is actually getting developed. And a lot of times they happen in parallel, which is, it still works, but it adds to this confusion of what actually should be scalable and far-reaching for other applications out there. So as a company, the politics is really based off of, let's take a step back, let's invest in this tool and the time in the beginning to be successful in this upcoming project as well as any future coming project. It takes a ridiculous amount of effort as well as to craft it really well. It takes someone with a very wide range of knowledge about interfaces as well as visual design. But you don't have to be at a crazy level to build these out, as long as you plan it just as you would plan for any project and take a really strategic architectural approach. But they do take time. They can involve complex methodologies on the development and architecture side, but this is one of those ones, to me, I don't think is necessarily a pain point. But if you have someone coming into your project that doesn't understand them, they may have a big question mark over their head. But why methodologies work is they should be easy to understand and just take some time and practice to learn it. But it can be a little hiccup on onboarding for team members. And I put this one up here, and I don't think this is negative, but they're platform agnostic, meaning that I'm still going out there and looking at my limitations and all the technology limitations in the browser matrix when building these out, but I want to be making sure that I'm building something that's going to be very far-reaching, but I'm not implementing and designing for a single platform here. And that can be a hiccup in a conversation that I've had many times with specific people on like the IT side, like, will this work in my platform? It's like, sure, yeah, we can make that work. And it requires updates. And I put this up as a pain point. It's not a negative thing. Style guides are their own project, and they should evolve. They should change over time, and they should be managed like any other project. They should not live inside the repo of your .com redesign. They should have their own repo, and they should have a team that's kind of constantly going back there that's shared across the whole business. All right, 8 benefits, and this is my last section here. So 8 stands for the 8th section. And I like to say I can't think of 2 more benefits, but I can think of 200 more. All right, so the first one is improving collaboration with the development team. And one of the roles I've always found myself in is being between marketing and IT, as well as between a visual designer and a developer. This becomes a really great way to communicate and plan for future projects that you may have, and also identifying the same language across multiple applications. Number 2 is the reduction in development efforts. So once it's created, you have this listing of all these components that you can utilize, copy, paste, and use in other cases. This is highly related to the next point, which is the increase to speed to market. So if you have this built out and you've taken that time in the beginning, you can turn around a page really, really quickly. I've been on the call with some clients and in a go-to meeting, and they're like, can we build out this page? Literally on the phone call with having just one hand holding up my phone and having another hand free, building out a web page for them. So the alignment of quality code, this is a huge piece, and I say every project should look like one developer developed it. And we should have alignment of quality code from a testing standpoint, as well as a documentation standpoint and utilization point. This is probably the biggest benefit in my mind on a day-to-day is it allows the team to focus on the experience rather than building out the interface. There's certain things in an interface I've probably built over 2,000 times, if not more, in my career. And I don't see that's a good use of my time or anyone on my team just recreate the same thing. I would rather be spending time about how we can improve our business, how we can actually make this project be a success, as opposed to building out the same thing. And I've heard, related to this, like front-end developers are like, well, if we build this out and do it really well, is it going to replace my job? And it's like, well, no, because you should be focusing on other aspects of that application and bringing your skill and your knowledge to extend it and maybe pushing back and enhancing the style guide long-term, but more focusing on the current experience rather than just building it out. There's a lot of things that never really fit into that initial launch of a project. One of the things I love is iterating in the browser. I gave that example about being on the phone and making something. But the big call out here is that you're designing and developing in the media that it's actually going to live in. It never made sense to me that I would be designing in Photoshop or other design programs and then have to convert it and maybe guess what the mobile site would look like. But here I can actually design and develop inside the browser. Now, we still do different page concepts and layouts, so we haven't moved far away, like completely away from Sketch and Photoshop, because it still has its benefits, and different team members can work faster in Photoshop than maybe Sketch. If you have an element collage, you can copy and utilize those pieces too, but this gets you to what it's actually going to look like in the final product, so aiming towards that final product. Flexibility for the ever-evolving brand, which is huge. I was on a project last year that was, it was an eight-month-long project. Month 6, we get a phone call and they say, hey, our brand has changed. And we're all like, why didn't you tell us that? They're like, well, it was really confidential. We didn't want to announce that. So they came with us with a change request and they were expecting like a 2 or 3 week turnaround. But in reality, we were able to design and also implement changes within 16 hours. So if crafted and architected correctly, it becomes really easy to adapt even in major changes like a complete brand redesign. And we didn't have to rewrite any of our DOM. And important is consistency. And consistency, not just from a development and coding standpoint, but also from an experience standpoint. So you roll out a new campaign, you have some new onboarding or enrollment on your site. You don't need to change how a button works. You've already trained your customers and your users to interact with it across your other applications. Why recreate it? Create consistent experiences, create consistent DOM, and also maintainability for it. Just some quick takeaways here, and then I'll stop yapping. But the number one, what makes a good style guide is support for multiple platforms, keeping it agnostic, but very far-reaching, working around those limitations. Number 2 is detailed documentation. Everyone hates it, but it's incredibly important. This is where Bootstrap actually does do a really good job. It has documentation that's solid. But think about how implementation as well as guidelines and restrictions on the brand identity can be documented. One that people don't really talk about that much, but it doesn't compete. I'm not an idiot. I realize that there's third-party tools that people use. Not everything can be customized. But as you're building out and crafting and architecting these things, you want to make sure that you're writing in a way, maybe it's namespaced, so it's not competing with third-party libraries, and you're not getting this collision of specificity as well as inheritance. So identifying and writing it so it doesn't compete. And the most important thing, and it's my last point, is it needs to be easy to use and understand. And if done correctly, I've seen non-developers and people that have limited technology abilities being able to copy and paste and create pages that are in HTML and CSS with, again, no development. So if done correctly, it can be a tool that not just developers use, but also your design team can use. In addition to it, these components should be really easy to find. So cool, I'm like right on time, but that's all I have. Thank you guys. I'm Nice Transition on Twitter. I love meeting people, I love talking. I'll be out there this afternoon, so come talk to me if you have questions, or tweet at me and I'll definitely respond. But thank you guys.